I had counted the cars for an hour before I understood that none of them were going to stop. That is the part nobody believes when I tell this now. Not the cold, though the cold was the kind that gets into the seams of you and stays. Not the dark, though the dark out on the Wendell Road comes down like a lid. What people cannot quite believe is the counting, that a woman can stand at a roadside in plain sight, hand half lifted, and watch 50 pairs of headlights swell up out of the night, wash white across her face, and slide on by without so much as easing off the throttle. I counted them because counting was the only thing my mind would do. 41, 42. The wind took the steam off my breath and threw it back over my shoulder. 43, and that one slowed, and my heart climbed up into my throat, and then it was only slowing for the bend, and it went on, and I was alone again with the broken sign and the dead phone and the small tin shelter that did nothing at all against the wind. I will tell you who I am, because it matters to the rest of it, though not in the way you'd think. My name is Nora Hale. I was 63 that winter. I had been a school teacher in the town of Marsbridge for 31 years, and I had retired the spring before, and I had spent most of that first free autumn discovering that a woman who has organized other people's lives for 3 decades does not always know what to do with the great unorganized stretch of her own. So when my sister fell ill 2 towns over, I went. Of course I went. I took the late coach because the late coach was cheapest, and the coach broke its axle on the Wendell Road 11 miles from anywhere, and the driver, a decent enough young man, frightened and apologetic, told us a relief vehicle would come within the hour and that we should wait at the shelters along the route. There were 2 other passengers. They had people coming for them by car. They were gone within 20 minutes, kindly enough, calling back that I should be along soon, and then it was the driver. And then the driver walked the other way up the road to flag the relief coach down at the junction. And then it was only me. An hour, I have said. By the time the counting started in earnest, it was nearer 2. You learn things about a stretch of road when you are made to stand still in it long enough. I learned that the Wendell Road carries a steady traffic even at that hour, delivery vans, late commuters, a coach or 2, and that not one of them owes you anything, and that most people, when they see a figure at a roadside in the dark, feel a small uncomfortable thing in the chest, and then a larger, faster relief as the figure slides past the window and is gone and becomes the next mile's problem. I do not blame them now. I blamed them then. I am ashamed to say how thoroughly I blamed them then, standing with my good coat not nearly good enough and my hands gone from aching to that worse thing past aching, where they simply stop reporting in. A woman alone at night learns to be afraid of the car that stops. That night, I had crossed over into the country where you are more afraid of the car that doesn't. The 50th car was a low dark thing that did not slow at all, and after it the road went empty for a long time, and in that emptiness something in me sat down. Not my body was still upright against the tin wall, because my body had been doing as it was told for 63 years and saw no reason to stop now. Something underneath the body. The part that had been saying he'll come, the relief will come, someone will come, that part lay down quietly and did not get up. I remember thinking, with a strange flat calm, that I might be in real trouble, that the cold was not a discomfort anymore but a thing with intent, that I could not feel my feet, and had stopped being able to remember, in any way that helped, what warm had been like. And then there were headlights again, and I did not lift my hand. That is the detail I come back to. I had stopped asking. 50 cars had taught me the lesson and I had learned it, and the 51st found a woman who had given up the asking, just a shape at a bus stop, head down, done. The headlights swung across the shelter. They held there a moment longer than the others had. And then I heard the thing I had stopped letting myself hope for. The long downward sigh of an engine coming off its speed, and the crunch of tires easing onto the gravel verge, and the particular settling silence of a vehicle that has decided to stop. I did not look up at first. I want to be honest about that. I had been disappointed so many times in 2 hours that I had taught myself not to look up, because looking up and being wrong had become the worst part, worse than the cold. So I heard the door and the boots on the gravel, unhurried, and a man's voice, low, even, carrying no alarm in it at all. The way you'd speak to a horse you didn't want to startle, say, "You've been out here a while." It was not a question. That is what made me look up. It was not, "Are you all right?" which is a question that asks you to perform an answer, to say yes when you mean no because a stranger in the dark is a thing to be managed. It was a plain statement of a plain fact. You've been out here a while. He had seen the truth of it from the road, and he had said the truth of it. And somehow that small accuracy was the first warm thing that had touched me in 2 hours. He was a big man, though he held himself in a way that made his size seem like something kept folded up and put away. Dark coat, plain, a working man's coat, not a fine one, and a wool cap pulled down, and a face I could not read much of in the dark beyond that it was still, calm and still. He had stopped his vehicle a little ahead and left the lights on, pointed away from me so they wouldn't blind me, and that too I noticed without understanding why I noticed it. He stood a respectful distance off, hands loose at his sides where I could see them. "My coach broke down," I said, and my voice came out wrong, cracked and slow, and I realized I had not spoken in 2 hours and that the cold had got into my speech the way it had got into everything else. They said a relief would come. The driver went to the junction. I think it's been a long time." "It's been more than a long time," he said. "It's been 2 hours by the frost on you." He didn't come closer. "What's your name?" "Nora," I said. "Nora Hale." "Mrs. Hale." A small nod, as though we had been introduced at a respectable function. "I'm going to do a few things, and I'll tell you each one before I do it so nothing surprises you. Is that all right?" I did not understand then why a stranger on a black road would think to say such a thing. I understand it now. But all I could do that night was nod, and feel something in my chest come loose that I had been holding clenched without knowing. "First thing," he said, "you're colder than you know. People in your state make poor judgments because the cold's already in the thinking. So I'm going to ask you to trust the judgment of a man who isn't cold yet for about the next half hour. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. It came out very small. "Good." He moved then, but slowly and not toward me, back to his vehicle, an old sturdy thing, and the door opened and shut, and he came back with a blanket folded over one arm and a flask in the other hand and a torch he kept pointed at the ground. "Wool blanket. I'm going to put it around your shoulders. I'm not going to touch you to do it. I'll hold it out and you take it. Some people don't want a stranger's hands, and they've every right not to." He held it out at arm's length. I took it. My hands would barely close on it, and he saw that, and waited, patient as a stone, while I fumbled the weight of it up onto my own shoulders, because he had understood without being told that there is a dignity in doing the last small thing for yourself, even when you can barely do it, and he was not going to take that from me to make it faster. The blanket was the warmest thing in the world. I want you to understand that I cried, a little when it came around me, not from gratitude exactly, though there was that, but from the simple animal shock of warmth after so long without it, the way a frozen thing aches worst at the moment it begins to thaw. "That'll hurt for a minute," he said, watching me. "The warming, it always hurts. It means it's working, don't fight it." "You've done this before," I said. He was quiet a moment, then, "I've stood in some cold places." He uncapped the flask. "Tea, strong with sugar in it. Not too hot, I know what I'm doing, it won't scald you. Small sips. If you gulp it, your stomach will turn over and we'll be worse off than we started." He poured a cup into the flask's lid and held it where I could take it, and again he did not push it into my hands but let me reach, and I took it, and the warmth came up through my dead fingers and the steam touched my face, and I had the strangest thought, sitting on the cold bench of that tin shelter 11 miles from anywhere, that I was, for the first time in 2 hours, being looked after. Not rescued in a great dramatic way. Looked after. The way you look after a thing you have decided without any fuss about it is now your responsibility. Why did you stop? I asked him. I had to know. 50 cars had taught me that stopping was not what people did. Nobody stops. I watched 50 of them. Why did you? He considered the question as though it were a fair and serious one, which I have come to learn is how he considered everything. Because you were there, he said. That was all. As if that settled it. As if the whole of the matter was contained in the fact that a person was standing in the cold and he had eyes to see her and a vehicle that had room in it, and the rest, the calculation, the weighing of inconvenience, the small cowardly arithmetic that turned 50 other drivers' wheels, simply did not enter into his world, because you were there. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the kind of man who answers that question that way and means it. Now, he said, the relief coach. Did the driver say where he'd flag it? The junction. The Wendell Junction, north. That junction's been closed 3 weeks for the bridge works. Anything coming for you is being routed the long way round, through Calder, and it'll come in from the south, behind you, not the north. Your driver went looking. He's a good lad, I'd guess, and badly informed, and he's standing at a junction no coach will pass tonight. He said it without heat, simply laying out the shape of the trouble. Which means no one is coming for you on this road. Not soon. Possibly not at all before morning. I felt the small flat calm I'd had earlier try to come back, the lying down feeling. He saw it cross my face. That's not a thing to be afraid of, he said, because it changes nothing about what happens next. Here is what happens next. I am going to take you off this road, somewhere warm and proper and safe, where the right people can be told where you are, and I am going to stay until I have handed you to someone whose job it is to have you. That's the whole of it. The road being empty just means I'm the one who does it. I don't mind being the one. You don't even know me, I said. No, he agreed. But I know what cold does, and I know what alone does, and I know that the distance between you being all right and you not being all right tonight is one person deciding to mind. I've decided to mind. You can stop carrying it now. You can stop carrying it now. I am 66 years old as I write this, and I have heard a great many kind things said over a long life, and I do not think any of them undid me quite the way those 5 words did, said by a stranger in a plain coat on the Wendell Road, with the frost on both of us and 50 cars worth of indifference still ringing in my ears. He helped me to his vehicle the way a man helps when he respects you, close enough to catch me if my dead feet went, never gripping, talking me through each step so I always knew what was coming. There's a curb here, a low one. Right foot first. Good. The seat's high, take my arm to come up if you want it, don't if you don't. He had the heater going before I was fully in, turned to me but not blasting, building slow, and he put the blanket back across my knees and said, warm comes back from the middle out. Don't worry about your feet for a while yet. They'll be last and they'll be the worst. That's normal. You're not in trouble, you're just thawing. And then, before he pulled away, he did a thing that I think of often. He got out again, walked back to the shelter and stood for a moment looking up and down the black road. I thought he was checking for the coach after all. He was not. When he came back he said, I wanted to be sure there wasn't anyone else in the dark out there I'd missed. Sometimes there's two. And he started the engine and we pulled off the verge, and I sat in the building warmth and watched the tin shelter shrink in the side mirror and disappear, and I understood that I had been very near to something that night, nearer than I had let myself know, and that a man I had never seen had simply decided, against all the evidence of 50 other men, that I was worth the stopping. We did not go far before he spoke again, and when he did it was to keep me talking, which I worked out later was deliberate. A person coming up out of cold should be kept present, kept here, not let to drift. He asked me about Marsbridge. He asked me what I had taught geography and history. I told him, 31 years of 9-year-olds and their wars and rivers. And he made a low sound that might have been a laugh, and said his own geography had been learned the hard way with his boots in it, and would not say more than that. He asked about my sister and where I'd been going and why, and I told him, and somewhere in the telling I stopped being a woman who had been left and started being a woman who was being carried somewhere safe. And the difference between those two women is the whole of what he gave me. I asked him at one point whether he was not cold himself, for he had given me his blanket and his tea and stood out in the wind a good while at the shelter, and he said no, that the cold did not get at him the way it got at other men, not because he didn't feel it, but because he had long ago made a sort of peace with it, the way you make peace with a thing you cannot argue your way out of. You stop fighting it, he said, eyes on the road, and it stops being your enemy. It's just the weather. It does what it does. You decide what you do. And I thought, sitting beside him in the dark with the warmth coming slowly back into me, that there was a whole philosophy folded into that, the philosophy of a man who has spent uncounted hours standing motionless in weather that would send other men running for shelter, and who has had to find, somewhere inside that endurance, a way to keep his mind awake and his heart open while his body holds still against the elements. The men who cannot do that go numb in the soul as well as the fingers. He had not gone numb. That was the thing about him I would only understand fully much later. That 30 years of being still in the cold had not frozen anything in him, but had instead burned away everything that was not essential, until what was left was simply a man who saw what was in front of him, and did what was needed, and did not make a great fuss about either. He told me one small thing on that drive, the only thing about himself he volunteered all night, and he told it sideways, the way modest men tell the things that matter to them. I had said something about how the road had been so empty, so indifferent, how I had felt I had fallen out of the world entirely. And he was quiet a while, and then he said that there had been a winter, years before, early in his service, when he was very young and very cold on a long night post, and he had begun to think the same kind of thought, that nobody saw him, that he was a thing the world walked past, that he might as well not be there for all the difference his standing made. And an old soldier, a sergeant near the end of his own service, had come along the line in the small hours and stopped by him and said one sentence and moved on. I asked him what the sentence was. He drove a little way before he answered. He said, "Lad, the whole point of the post is that someone is here when no one thinks anyone needs to be. The night you understand that is the night you become a guardsman instead of a man in a costume." And Edmund Carrow said that he had stood there the rest of that night turning it over, and that it had changed the way he stood every night after, and that he supposed, when you came down to it, that was why he had eased off the throttle on the Wendell Road when 50 other men had not. Someone is here when no one thinks anyone needs to be. He had carried that sentence for 30 years, off the post and onto it and off again, and it had been waiting in him, fully loaded, for the night a frozen woman would need it. He took me to a place called the Calder Cross, an old coaching inn on the South Road, the kind of low-beamed, warm-lit place that has been pulling cold travelers in off bad roads for 300 years and knows exactly how to do it. He did not just drop me at the door. He came in. He spoke to the woman behind the bar, Mrs. Ardle. I would learn her name in time, for I have been back many times since, and I heard him say low, "This is Mrs. Hale. She's been 2 hours in the cold on the Wendell Road, a broken coach, nobody stopped. She needs the fire, something hot, and a telephone that works, and somebody to sit with her while the right people are called. I'll stay till that's done. Can you do the rest?" And Mrs. Ardle, who has the sense God gives to people who run inns, looked at me once and saw the whole of it and said, "Bring her to the fire." They put me in the great chair by the hearth and the heat of real fire came at me and I shook, properly shook, the way you do when the danger is over and your body finally lets itself admit there was danger. He crouched by the chair. He was good at making himself low and unalarming. I had noticed it at the shelter, this big man who knew how to take up less room when a frightened person needed him to, and he said, "This is the shaking I told you about. It's good. Let it. You're safe now. I'm going to make the calls, and I'm not leaving until there's someone here who's yours." He made the calls. I heard him be patient on the telephone with the coach company in a way that made things happen, not loud, never loud, but with a kind of immovable steadiness that I came to think of, much later, as the sound of a man who has spent his life standing somewhere he was not allowed to leave, and has brought that gift off the post and into the world with him. He found my sister's number from me and rang the hospital and got word to her that I was safe and warm and would come on the morning's road. He arranged a room at the Calder Cross for the night, and when I tried to fuss about the cost he said only, "It's seen to," in a way that closed the matter, and I learned later that he had seen to it himself and asked Mrs. Ardle never to tell me, and she kept his word for almost a year before I wore it out of her. And all the while he did not once make me feel like a burden. That is the thing. A burden is what 50 cars had decided I would be. He had decided I was not a burden but a person, and there is no greater gift one stranger can hand another on a cold night than the decision, made quietly and kept without fuss, that you are a person and not a problem. And then the door of the Calder Cross opened, and the cold came in on a young man. He was perhaps 20, soaked to the knee, white-lipped, shaking worse than I had been, and he stood in the doorway in that lost way a person stands when they have walked a long way in the dark with no plan beyond the walking. A delivery rider, it turned out, whose machine had failed him 3 miles up the South Road, who had no money and a dead phone of his own, and a depot that would dock his pay for the load if he didn't get it through, and who had decided, being young and frightened and proud, that the answer was to walk it on his back through the freezing dark rather than ask anyone for anything. He had got as far as the Calder Cross before his legs began to go. I watched Edmund Caro then, and I will never forget what I saw, because it taught me the rest of what I had begun to learn at the shelter. He did not sigh. He did not glance at the door he had been about to walk out of, the warm bed waiting somewhere down the South Road, the home he had been driving toward when he found me. There was no flicker of a man weighing whether he had done enough for one night, whether this second cold stranger was someone else's to manage now. He simply turned, the way a compass turns, and the same stillness that had crouched by my chair stood up and crossed the room to the boy in the doorway, and I heard him say the same 5 words he had said to me on the road. "You've been out there a while." And the same thing happened in the young man's face that had happened in mine, the unclenching, the small collapse of a person who has just discovered, against the evidence of a long cold dark, that someone has decided to mind. The boy started to apologize, to explain, to make himself small and manageable, and Edmund stopped him with a hand held flat, not unkindly. "There's nothing to be sorry for. Come to the fire. We'll sort the load in the depot after. First we get the cold out of you." Mrs. Ardle another blanket and the same again, hot, slow sips. He looked back at me, and there was the ghost of something in the still face, the nearest thing to a smile I saw from him all night. I did say, "Sometimes there's two. Sometimes there's two." He had said it at the shelter as a reason to walk back and check the black road, and I had thought it a strange thing to say, and here it was come true within the hour. A second person plucked out of the same cold night by the same man who had every reason on earth to be home in his bed and asleep. And he did for the boy exactly what he had done for me. The blanket held out at arm's length so the lad could take it himself and keep his dignity. The tea not too hot. The telephone worked patiently until the depot was made to understand that no, the load would not be docked. The machine had failed, and the rider had behaved better than the company had any right to expect, and a man was telling them so who did not raise his voice but somehow could not be argued with. He arranged for the boy's load to be collected safe, and for the boy himself to have the small room next to the one he had quietly paid for me to have, and again he asked Mrs. Ardle to keep the paying of it to herself. I said to him, "Lo, while the boy thawed by the fire, you were going home." "I was," he said. "You'd already stopped for one stranger tonight. Most men would think that was a full night's good deed and drive on. You'd have earned it." He looked at me with something close to puzzlement, as though I had said a thing in a language he did not quite speak. "It isn't a sum you do," he said at last. "It isn't a quota you fill and then you're allowed to drive past the next one. There's a person in the cold or there isn't. Tonight there were two. If there'd been three, there'd have been three." He said it the way another man might explain that water runs downhill, not as a virtue, not as a thing he was proud of, but as a plain fact about how the world is arranged and what a person does in it. And I understood that this was the deepest part of him, deeper even than the stopping, that he did not keep a ledger. He had not decided to be good once, that night, in a burst of feeling, and then felt himself excused. He had simply never once entertained the idea that there was a number of cold strangers past, which a man was permitted to look away. It was very late by then. The fire had got the worst of the cold out of me, and the tea Mrs. Ardle brought had got the rest, and my feet had come back, screaming as he'd promised and then merely aching, and I was warm, truly warm, for the first time since the coach had thrown its axle into the dark. The young man slept at last in the great chair, and Mrs. Ardle laid a blanket over him, and Edmund Caro stood to go. I understood that he was the kind of man who, his work done, would simply leave, would not stand about waiting to be thanked, because the thanks had never been the point, and I could not bear to let him go without knowing even his name. "You haven't told me who you are," I said. He paused by the door, half-turned. "It doesn't matter much." "It matters to me," I said. "I'm going to think about tonight for the rest of my life. I would like to know whose face I'm thinking of." He considered that, and I think it was the only thing I asked him all night that he found difficult. Then he said, Edmund Caro." "And what do you do, Edmund Caro, that you stop for a woman 50 other men drove past, and you know about cold, and you can be patient with a coach company until it does what it ought, and you crouch low so you won't frighten her, and you check the dark for a second one?" He was quiet for a moment, and something moved across that still face, not pride. I have never once seen pride on it, but something quieter and harder to name. "I stand a post," he said. "Off duty tonight. Driving home." And then, because I think he saw I did not fully understand and he did not want me to make him into more than he was, "It's only standing still, Mrs. Hale. Anyone can do it. The trick is staying awake to the one moment in a long, cold watch when standing still isn't the thing required of you anymore." He touched the brim of his cap. "Get warm, get to your sister. You did nothing wrong tonight. You were just on a bad road." And he went out into the dark, and I heard the old sturdy vehicle start and pull away south, and I sat by the fire of the Calder Cross and wept again, the good kind, and Mrs. Ardle sat with me and did not ask why. But before he had gone, and I had nearly forgotten this in the telling, because it was such a small thing and he made it so small, he had done one last bit of seeing. To that I think shows the whole of the man better than any of the grand parts. He had stopped at the door, his hand already on it, and turned back and crossed the room again and crouched once more by my chair. And he had said, very low, so the boy by the fire would not hear and be shamed, "That lad's going to want to slip away before light and walk on, because he's proud and he's young and he doesn't want to be a charity case in the morning when the room's awake and looking at him. Don't let him. Tell Mrs. Ardle to feed him a proper breakfast and put it about that the depot's already squared and there's a lift arranged. There will be. I'll telephone it through tonight, so he can take the help without it costing him his pride. A man can starve sooner than be pitied. Give him the help dressed up as ordinary and he'll take it and be a better man for it." And then he had nodded, satisfied, the way a man nods who has checked the last item off a list only he could see, and gone. I have turned that over many times. He was a stranger who had known the boy for 40 minutes. He was tired and it was past midnight and his own warm bed was an hour down a frozen road. And in the middle of all that he had thought ahead, 2 and 3 moves ahead, to a thing that would happen at first light after he was long gone, the proud boy creeping out into the cold rather than face being pitied. And he had quietly arranged the whole of the morning so that it could not happen, and asked nothing in return, and would never know whether his plan had worked. It did work, by the way. The boy ate his breakfast and took his lift believing the whole thing was a matter of course, and shook my hand at the door with his pride intact, and went on into his life. He never knew that a stranger had spent his last 5 minutes in building him a small dignity to wake up inside of. That is what I mean when I say the stopping was not even the deepest part. The deepest part was the seeing not just the cold body in front of him but the whole person, forward and backward in time, the pride and the fear and the mourning that hadn't come yet, and the minding of all of it. And Mrs. Ardle, who had watched the whole of it from behind her bar across 2 long hours, said to me as we sat by the fire, "I've kept this in 19 years. I've seen a deal of travelers come in off bad roads, and a deal of folk help them, and most help the way you'd toss a coin to a beggar quick, and a little for themselves in it, to feel the warmth of having been good. I never once saw a man help the way that one did. He didn't help you. He just took you over like you were his own and set you down safe, and never once made it about him." She shook her head slowly. "Whoever raised that one, or whatever did, they made something the world doesn't make many of anymore. I did find out in time what Edmund Caro does, though he never told me more than he told me that night, and I will tell you, because it is the heart of the thing and he would never say it himself. It was nearly a year later. I had gone back to the Calder Cross. I went back often. It had become a place that meant something to me, and I had at last worn the truth of the bill out of Mrs. Ardle, and I had pressed her, gently and relentlessly, the way a schoolteacher presses about the man. And she had laughed and shaken her head and said, "You really don't know, you who watched him for an hour and never guessed." And she had reached under the bar and brought out a newspaper she had kept, folded for the better part of that year, because she had known one day I would ask. It was a photograph of a state occasion, a great public ceremony, ranks of ceremonial guards in their full dress, the tall dark fur of the headpieces, the red of the tunics, the white gloves, the polished metal of it all, the immaculate motionless splendor of men trained past flinching. And in the front rank, one face among the row of disciplined faces, eyes forward, jaw set perfectly, monumentally still, a man holding a stillness so complete it looked carved, was him, Edmund Caro. The man who had crouched low by my chair so as not to frighten me, the man who had checked the black road for a second one. I sat with that photograph for a long time. I had been carried off a freezing road by one of those men, one of the famous statues, the ones the whole country knows for not moving, not speaking, not breaking no matter what the crowd does in front of them. The men who are mocked for it sometimes by people who think the stillness is the whole of them, who think a man who can stand that still must be empty inside, must be nothing but the uniform and the discipline and the not reacting. And I understood, finally, what he had been trying to tell me at the door. It's only standing still. The trick is staying awake to the one moment when standing still isn't the thing required. That is what they train into those men, you see, and I did not know it until him, and I do not think most people know it. We look at them on their posts and we see the discipline, the iron, the man who will not be moved by the tourist who shouts in his face or the fool who tries to make him laugh, and we think the not moving is the lesson. It isn't. The not moving is only the patience. The real lesson, the deep one, the one that lives underneath 30 years of standing still, is the watching. The staying awake. The being there, fully there, hour upon empty hour, so that on the one occasion in 10,000 when something is actually wrong, when something actually needs a man to step off the post and act, there is a man still present behind the stillness who sees it and does it without hesitation, because he never once let himself go to sleep inside the uniform. 50 cars drove past me on the Wendell Road. 50 drivers, warm and hurried and full of their own evenings, each of them seeing a shape in the cold and feeling that small, uncomfortable thing in the chest, and then driving on into the comfortable forgetting. And the man who stopped, the only one, the 51st, was the one whose whole life's work was the discipline of not driving on, of staying awake. of being in the long, cold dark when nobody is watching and there is no parade and no crowd and no medal in it, exactly as present and exactly as ready as he is on the grandest day of state, because to him there was never any difference. A post is a post. A person in the cold is a person in the cold. You don't move when you mustn't. You move at once when you must. And the whole of a man's honor is in knowing, in the dead middle of an ordinary freezing Tuesday night with no one to see, which of those moments he is in. I wrote to him, of course. It took me 3 months and the grudging help of Mrs. Ardle and a sympathetic clerk to get a letter to him through the proper channels, and it was a long letter, and I will not set it all down here, but I will tell you the one thing I most wanted him to know, which was this: that for 2 hours on the Wendell Road I had been quietly deciding that people in the main did not stop, that I had been counting cars and counting myself out of the world's keeping with everyone that passed, and that he had reached down into that cold arithmetic and changed the sum. One person decided to mind, he had said. He had no idea, I think, that he was not only saving a cold woman that night but saving something in her about the whole of the human race. The part that had been about to conclude, on good evidence, that we are mostly the kind of creatures who drive past. He wrote back. It was a short letter, as I had known it would be. He thanked me for mine. He said he was glad I had reached my sister and gladder still that she had recovered, for I had told him she had. And then, at the bottom, in a plain, even hand that looked exactly the way his voice had sounded on that road, he wrote a single line that I have framed and that hangs now beside my fire, and that I read on the cold nights when the wind gets up, and I think of the women and the men out on the bad roads of the world tonight, waiting, counting cars. It said, we are taught to stand still so that we will be there. Being there was always the whole of the job. E.C. I have thought about that line for years, and I do not think I will ever get to the bottom of it. There is a whole creed folded up inside it, a whole way of carrying yourself through a life. Being there was always the whole of the job, not the standing still. The standing still is only the form it takes when nothing is required. The job is the being there, ready, awake, minded, so that on the one night it matters you have not drifted off inside yourself and become the 51st car. He had been there. He had been off duty, driving home, his post a long way behind him and his bearskin in its box and no eyes on him and no order given, and he had been every bit as on duty as the day they photographed him for the newspaper, because the duty was never the uniform. The duty was the man underneath it, and the man underneath it does not clock off from being the kind of man who stops. There is a thing people get wrong about men like him, and I got it wrong too before that night, and I want to set it down because it is the whole point of why I have written any of this. We see the ceremonial guard on his post, the famous stillness, the bearskin, the rifle, the face that will not move for anything, and we think of him as a kind of beautiful machine, a figure, a piece of the building. We line up to take his photograph and we try to make him laugh and we marvel at how he does not break, and underneath the marveling there is a small condescension we do not even notice in ourselves, the sense that the discipline has hollowed him out, that to stand that still for that long a man must have given something up, traded his ordinary human softness for the iron. We pity him a little, even as we admire him. We think the uniform is the man. It is exactly backward. That is what I learned on the Wendell Road, carried off the ice by one of them in a plain coat with his uniform 100 miles away in its box. The discipline had not hollowed Edmund Caro out. It had done the opposite. It had taken an ordinary man, and over 30 years of making him stand awake and present and minding through 10,000 cold and boring and unwatched hours, it had drilled the indifference out of him. The very indifference that turned 50 other men steering wheels straight past me that night. Most of us spend our lives learning, without meaning to, how to not see, how to let the figure at the roadside slide past the window, how to feel the small, uncomfortable thing in the chest, and then the larger relief of forgetting. We get good at it. We call it getting on with our lives. And the men on the post spend their lives unlearning exactly that, training themselves, hour after silent hour, to stay awake to the world in front of them, to keep seeing when every nerve says you may stop now. Nothing is happening. No one will know if you go to sleep inside yourself. The stillness we pity them for is the very thing that kept him human enough to stop. So when the uniform came off and he was only a tired private man driving home in the dark, off duty, no one watching, no order given, no medal in it, nothing in the whole wide night to make him do anything but drive on the way 50 others drove on, the thing that was left, the man underneath the bearskin, was a man who had simply lost the ability to not see a person in the cold. They had drilled that incapacity right out of him. He could not drive past me, not because a rule said he mustn't, for there was no rule out there on the Wendell Road, no post, no captain, no one to answer to. He could not drive past me because 30 years of standing his watch had made him, all the way down, the kind of man who is always everywhere on watch, and a man on watch, a real one, does not get to choose which suffering is his to see. I am an old woman now, and I do not stand long in the cold anymore, but I drive that road sometimes, the Wendell Road, on purpose, just to pass the tin shelter 11 miles from anywhere where I once stood and counted 50 cars and gave up. I slow down every time. I have once or twice found someone there, a stranded walker, a girl whose bicycle had thrown its chain, an old man waiting for a bus that it turned out had been canceled and would not come. And I have stopped. Of course I have stopped. I roll the window down and I say the thing he said to me, the thing that is not a question, because a question asks a frightened person to perform. You've been out here a while. And I watch the same loosening come into their faces that came into mine, the small unclenching of a person who has just learned that someone has decided to mind. And I carry them somewhere warm and proper and safe, and I stay until they are handed to someone whose job it is to have them, and I do not let them feel like a burden. And before I pull away, I look up and down the dark road to be sure there isn't a second one I've missed. Because sometimes there are two. I am the 51st car now on that road when I can be. He made me one. That is the last and quietest thing he gave me, and the one I think he would care about most if he ever knew it, though I have never told him, and I think I never will, because men like Edmund Caro do not stop in order to be thanked or thought well of or written about in the small way I am writing about him now. They stop because someone is there in the cold and they have eyes to see it and room in the vehicle and a life's worth of discipline that taught them, above everything else it taught them, never to drive on. Because you were there. That was the whole of his reason, and I have come to believe it is the whole of every reason worth having. We make it complicated. We weigh the inconvenience and the lateness and the cold and the risk and the 1,000 small cowardly sums, and we slide past in the warm dark and become the next mile's problem, and we tell ourselves someone else will stop. Someone else did not stop. 50 someones did not stop. And then one man, who had trained his whole life at the one discipline that turns out to matter more than all the others, the discipline of staying awake to the moment you are needed, eased off the throttle on the Wendell Road and crunched onto the gravel and got out into the cold and saved a woman's life and very nearly her faith in people, and would have told you if you'd asked that it was nothing, that it was only standing still, that anyone could have done it. Anyone could have. 50 of them were given the chance that very night. He was the one who did. I keep his line by the fire. We are taught to stand still so that we will be there. And on the nights when the wind comes up out of the dark and rattles the windows, I think of all the cold roads in the world, and all the shapes standing at the edges of them with their hands half lifted, counting cars, beginning to give up. And I hope, with everything in me, that somewhere out in that dark there is a man in a plain coat driving home off duty, his post behind him, awake.